Every morning, as the soft London mist floated through the gates of Buckingham Palace, a small boy in a wheelchair could be seen waiting near the front fence. His name was Ethan. He was 10 years old, with bright brown eyes and a smile that seemed to fight against the sadness hiding behind it. His mother, Laura, always stood close by, wrapping a blanket around his legs whenever the wind blew colder than usual. The palace guards stood tall and silent, dressed in their red coats and black hats, marching with perfect steps that echoed across the courtyard. To most people, they were just part of a tourist attraction, but to Ethan, they were heroes. He loved the way they never moved, no matter what happened around them. People laughed, took pictures, and tried to make them smile, but they stayed still, calm and strong. Ethan's mother had told him that the royal guards were trained to protect the king and the palace, and that their job was about honor, respect, and bravery. Ever since then, Ethan had been fascinated. Maybe it was because he felt weak most of the time and wanted to know what it felt like to stand tall like them. Or maybe it was because deep down he wanted to believe he could be brave too, even if he couldn't walk. Ethan had been in a wheelchair since he was 3. He was born with a muscle condition that made his legs too weak to carry his body. Over the years, he had gone through several operations and painful therapies. Doctors had told Laura that her son might never walk. The words had crushed her heart the first time she heard them, but she never let Ethan see her cry. She told him every night before bed, "You can do anything, Ethan, even if your legs are slow. Your heart is faster than anyone's." And every morning, she proved it by pushing his wheelchair all the way to the palace gate so he could see his heroes march. The first time they went there, Ethan had watched in silence, completely amazed. He couldn't believe real people could stand so straight for so long without moving a muscle. He clapped when they changed shifts, waving excitedly at them, though none of the guards looked back. But that didn't bother him. Just being there made him happy. It became a tradition between him and his mother. Every week, when Laura had her day off from her job at a small bakery, they would pack sandwiches, take the train, and spend a few hours by the palace. Ethan liked watching the tourists, too. He enjoyed how children giggled when the guards marched by and how adults pointed and whispered about their uniforms. But what he loved most was imagining himself in one of those tall bearskin hats. Sometimes he would lift his chin, puff his chest, and whisper, "Left, right, left," pretending to march in rhythm with them. His mother would laugh softly and say, "You look like a real guard, my love." Those words always made his cheeks turn red with pride. One morning in early spring, something different happened. The sky was clear, and sunlight danced on the polished buttons of the guards' coats. Ethan and Laura arrived earlier than usual and the crowd was smaller. As the guards marched toward the courtyard gate, one of them, taller than the rest with blue eyes and a strong face, turned his head slightly. For the smallest second, his eyes met Ethan's. It wasn't much, just a tiny glance, but to Ethan it felt like the whole world stopped. That royal guard had seen him. Ethan froze. His small hands gripped the sides of his wheelchair. "Mom," he whispered, "he looked at me." Laura smiled, pretending she hadn't noticed. "Maybe he did," she said softly. But inside, she felt her heart warm. It had been so long since she'd seen her son that excited. Ethan's smile didn't fade the entire day. On the way home, he kept talking about the guard, the one who noticed him. He even gave him a nickname, Sergeant Strong. Over the next few days, Ethan couldn't stop thinking about that moment. When he went to physical therapy, he told his instructor about it. When his grandmother called, he talked about it again. "He saw me, Grandma," Ethan said proudly. "One of the real guards looked right at me." His grandmother laughed on the phone and told him, "Then you must be special, darling." And deep inside, Ethan started to believe it. A week later, Laura took him back to the palace again. It had become their secret mission, to find the same guard. Ethan wore his favorite blue jacket and kept looking at the line of guards, trying to spot the familiar face. When he finally saw him standing near the left side of the gate, he almost shouted out loud. But his mother gently stopped him. "Remember, sweetie, they can't talk when they're on duty," she reminded. Ethan nodded and just waved quietly instead. The guard didn't move, of course. But this time, Ethan noticed something subtle. A small twitch at the corner of the man's mouth, almost like the beginning of a smile. After that, something unspoken formed between them. Each time Ethan came to the palace, that same guard would somehow glance his way during his post. Sometimes, when the guards changed positions, Ethan could tell the man slowed down just slightly near the fence where he sat. It wasn't enough for others to notice, but Ethan always did. He began to feel like the guard was watching out for him. One afternoon, it started to rain. The crowd quickly disappeared under umbrellas, but Ethan refused to leave. "Just 5 more minutes, Mom," he begged. Laura hesitated but stayed. The rain grew stronger, tapping against the metal bars of his wheelchair. Then something unexpected happened. From the palace gate, one guard, Ethan's guard, stepped forward for a brief moment. He looked straight at the boy, then at the sky, and tilted his head slightly as if to say, "Go inside, it's raining." Laura noticed it too and quickly pushed the wheelchair toward shelter. But as they moved away, Ethan kept looking back, smiling through the rain. He whispered softly, "He told me to stay safe." That night, Laura watched her son sleep and thought about how something as simple as a small glance could give a child so much hope. She remembered the endless hospital visits, the nights of pain when Ethan cried quietly thinking she couldn't hear. And now, here he was, dreaming about palace guards instead of surgeries. For the first time in years, Laura felt like maybe the world was being kind again. The next morning, when Ethan woke up, the first thing he asked was, "Do you think the guard will be there again, Mom?" Laura smiled. "Maybe he will. Maybe he's waiting for you." Ethan nodded with determination. "Then I want to go again next week." And that became their new plan. As the days passed, Ethan's excitement grew. He drew pictures of guards standing in front of the palace and even made a paper hat that looked like theirs. He told his mother he wanted to become strong like them one day. Laura always replied, "You already are." But what neither of them knew was that the Royal Guard, Sergeant James Turner, had noticed Ethan more than once. Each time he saw the small boy in the wheelchair, his heart tightened. He had seen children before, but there was something about this one, the way he sat up straight, the way he saluted even when no one asked, that touched something deep inside him. James had been a soldier before becoming a guard, and he had seen courage in many forms. But this boy's quiet bravery reminded him that sometimes strength has nothing to do with standing tall. It's about not giving up. That night, when his shift ended, James stood outside the palace gates for a few minutes longer than usual. The crowds were gone. The air smelled of rain. He looked at the spot where the boy always sat and thought about how much happiness that simple visit seemed to bring. For the first time in years, James smiled to himself, a small, real smile that no one saw. He decided that the next time the boy came, he would do something no royal guard usually did. He would break the silence. And that small decision, made quietly under the London rain, was about to change both their lives forever. The next Saturday morning came bright and quiet. The streets of London were slowly waking up as the first tourists began to gather near Buckingham Palace. Laura pushed Ethan's wheelchair carefully through the cobblestone path. He was wearing a new red jacket today, the same color as the guards' uniforms. His small hands gripped the armrests tightly and his eyes shone with excitement. He was hoping the same guard, the one he called Sergeant Strong, would be there again. When they reached their usual spot near the black iron fence, Ethan's heart started to beat faster. The guards were already standing in formation, their tall black hats shining under the soft morning sun. Ethan looked at each face one by one until he finally saw him. The same tall guard with sharp blue eyes and calm posture stood near the gate, his boots perfectly lined. Ethan's smile widened. "Mom, that's him." "That's the one," he whispered excitedly. Laura nodded, smiling warmly. "I see him, honey. Remember, they can't talk while on duty." "I know," Ethan said softly, but his gaze stayed fixed on the man. For a long time, he just watched. The guard didn't move at all, yet something about his stillness felt alive, almost comforting. Then something unexpected happened. During the guard change, when the soldiers turned sharply and marched toward the gate, the tall guard's eyes flicked toward Ethan for a second. It was only a moment, but this time he didn't just glance. He gave a small nod, barely noticeable, but Ethan saw it clearly. The boy gasped. "Mom, he nodded at me." Laura blinked in surprise. "Are you sure?" "Yes." "He looked right at me and nodded." Ethan's voice trembled with joy. Laura's eyes softened. She didn't know whether the guard had really done it or if her son imagined it, but either way, she didn't correct him. "That's wonderful, sweetheart," she said gently. After the ceremony ended, the crowd slowly began to leave. The guards returned to their positions. Laura was about to turn Ethan's wheelchair around when she noticed movement from the gate. The tall guard was walking toward them. For a moment, she thought she must be mistaken. Royal guards never broke formation to approach visitors. but he kept coming. He stopped right by the fence, removed his black bearskin hat, and smiled. Ethan froze. His mouth opened in surprise. You can talk?" The man chuckled quietly. "Only when I'm off duty." His voice was deep but kind. He crouched slightly so he could look Ethan in the eyes. "I've seen you here quite a few times," he said. "You have a good eye for discipline, young man." Laura was too stunned to speak. She had never seen a guard act this way. Ethan blinked and said shyly, "I like watching you all." "You're really brave," the guard smiled. "Bravery isn't about not being scared. It's about doing something even when you are." Ethan tilted his head. "Are you scared sometimes?" "Of course," the man said with a small nod. "Everyone is. But we stand anyway. That's what makes us strong." Laura finally found her voice. "Thank you, sir." You've made his day. He talks about you all week. The guard looked at her kindly. "It's my honor. My name's James Turner." "I'm Laura," she replied softly. "And this is Ethan." James smiled. "Ethan," he said, turning back to the boy. "You've got a soldier's spirit, you know that?" "I can see it in your eyes," Ethan grinned. "Do you think I could be a guard one day?" James thought for a moment, then answered, "There are many ways to stand guard in this world. Some people do it with their legs. Some do it with their heart. You, my friend, already stand taller than most." Those words stayed in Ethan's mind long after James returned to duty. On the train ride home, he kept repeating them under his breath. "Stand taller with your heart," he whispered, smiling at his reflection in the window. Laura looked at her son and felt her throat tighten. That one meeting had lit something inside him, a spark of hope she hadn't seen in years. Over the next few weeks, James Turner began to notice how he looked forward to his post more than ever before. He found himself glancing toward the crowd, hoping to see the boy in the red jacket. And each time he did, his day felt lighter. Sometimes, when his shift ended, he walked by the gate on his way out, pretending to check something, but really just to give Ethan a quick wave. It became their quiet tradition, a secret exchange of encouragement between a guard and a child. One day, after his duty ended early, James found himself walking toward the fence again. The crowd had already gone, but Ethan and his mother were still there. Ethan was practicing a salute, trying to mimic how the guards moved. His small hand was shaking, but his eyes were full of focus. James smiled and walked closer. "That's a good salute," he said warmly. "But you forgot one thing, the chest up, shoulders back." Ethan giggled and straightened himself. "Like this?" "Perfect," James said. "Now you look like a real guard." Laura watched from behind, her heart swelling with gratitude. "You really don't have to do this," she said softly. James turned to her. "Maybe not. But sometimes doing something small for someone can mean a lot more than you think." From that day, he began visiting Ethan more often, always after his shifts, when he was off duty. They would talk near the palace gate, sharing little stories. James told Ethan about his training days in the army, about how he once struggled to keep balance during drills and fell flat on his face in front of everyone. Ethan laughed so hard that even James couldn't help but laugh too. One afternoon, James brought something with him, a small toy soldier wearing a red coat just like his uniform. "He's missing his hat," Ethan noticed, studying it closely. James smiled. "That's because you're supposed to imagine it yourself. Every guard needs imagination to stay strong when things get hard." Ethan held the toy tightly. "I'll keep it safe," he said seriously. "I know you will," James replied. From then on, Ethan carried the toy soldier everywhere. During therapy sessions, he kept it beside him as if it gave him courage. His therapist, a kind woman named Megan, noticed the change in his attitude. "You're trying harder these days, Ethan," she said one morning as he practiced standing with support. Ethan nodded. "I promised Sergeant Turner I'd get stronger." "Who's Sergeant Turner?" "He's my friend. He's a Royal Guard." "He said I already stand tall in my heart," Megan smiled. "Then I think you're on your way to standing tall with your legs, too." Later that week, James asked Laura if he could speak with her privately. They stepped aside while Ethan played with his toy soldier. "I've been thinking," James began. "Would it be all right if I helped with his therapy? I've got experience from my military background, balance, posture, motivation. Maybe it could make a difference." Laura blinked, taken aback. "You'd really do that?" "You don't even know us," James nodded firmly. "I may not know your story, but I know what it's like to see someone fight every day and not give up. That boy reminds me why I put on this uniform." Laura felt her eyes sting. "You're very kind," she whispered. "He believes in you, you know. He thinks you're a hero. James looked down for a moment. Maybe one day he'll realize the real hero is him. That evening, as Ethan slept peacefully with the toy soldier beside his pillow, Laura sat by the window, thinking about everything that had happened. Life had been hard. Years of hospitals, tight budgets, endless worries, but somehow this royal guard had brought a light into their world. A stranger who cared enough to notice. At the palace, James stood at his post under the evening sky. The wind was cool and the lamps glowed softly on the courtyard walls. He remembered the boy's laugh, the way he saluted with his trembling hand, and how he refused to give up even when the world had told him he couldn't stand. A small smile touched his lips. He decided right there that he would keep his promise to that boy, to help him stand one day no matter how long it took. Neither of them knew yet how far that promise would go. But from that night on, both their lives began to change in quiet, beautiful ways, one step at a time. The next few weeks brought small changes that meant everything to Ethan and his mother. Every morning he woke up early, full of energy, asking, "Mom, are we going to the palace today?" Sometimes they went, sometimes not. But even on the days they couldn't, Ethan practiced what James had taught him. He lifted his head high, kept his chest out, and whispered to himself, "Stand tall with your heart." James Turner had become more than just a royal guard to them. He was now part of their little world. He visited whenever he could after his shifts, sometimes still wearing his red coat, other times in simple clothes. He never came empty-handed. Once he brought a framed picture of the guards marching in front of the palace. He handed it to Ethan and said, "You belong here too, you know. Maybe not in uniform, but in spirit." Ethan looked at the photo as if it were a treasure. "One day I'll stand like that," he whispered. James smiled. "You will, lad. You will." He began helping Ethan with his therapy sessions on weekends. Laura was surprised when the therapist, Megan, agreed to let James assist. But after watching him for just a few minutes, she understood why. James had a way of speaking that made people believe they could do anything. When Ethan struggled to balance, James didn't rush to help him up. Instead, he calmly said, "Look forward, soldier. Every guard falls before he stands." Ethan laughed every time he called him soldier. It made him feel strong. It made him feel equal. The session started small. Ethan practiced standing while holding parallel bars. His legs trembled and his hands shook, but James was always right behind him. "1 second longer," he would say. "That's all we need." Sometimes Ethan made it for 2 seconds. Sometimes he couldn't last more than 1. But James always clapped softly and said, "That's progress." Laura often watched them from the corner of the room. Her heart swelled every time she saw her son take even the tiniest step forward. She had spent years praying for hope, and now hope had a face. It was Sergeant James Turner's. One afternoon, as the three of them sat in the palace gardens after therapy, Ethan asked a question that made James pause. "Sergeant Turner, why do you help me so much?" James looked at the boy, then at the garden filled with spring flowers. "Because once someone helped me when I didn't believe I could get back up." Ethan tilted his head. "Did you fall?" James nodded slowly. "Yes, a long time ago before I became a guard. I was a soldier then. I got hurt in training, and for a while I thought I'd never walk properly again. But there was an older officer. He told me, 'You're only beaten when you stop trying.' I didn't stop trying. And here I am." Ethan's eyes widened. "So you know how it feels?" "Yes," James said softly. "That's why I understand you better than you think." Laura felt her eyes sting. She turned away quickly so neither of them would see her tears. The connection between her son and this man had grown into something rare and pure, built not on pity, but on shared strength. One chilly morning in late autumn, James arrived at their small apartment with an envelope in hand. "What's that?" Ethan asked, curious. "It's a letter from the palace," James said with a smile. "I asked for special permission to use a small training room inside the palace courtyard for your therapy sessions. And they said yes." Ethan gasped. "Inside the palace?" "Really?" James nodded. "Only a few hours every week. But yes, we'll train where the guards do." Laura couldn't believe it. "James, you didn't have to—" "I wanted to," he interrupted gently. "If Ethan's going to learn to stand, he deserves to do it somewhere he feels proud." That weekend, they arrived at the palace for the first session. A few guards and officers nodded respectfully as they passed. The training room was small but bright, with wooden floors and tall windows that looked out toward the courtyard. Ethan's wheelchair rolled quietly over the floor. He looked around, amazed. It's beautiful, he whispered. James placed a hand on his shoulder. This is where brave people train, Ethan, and today you're one of them. They began slowly. Ethan held onto a rail, trying to push himself up with James beside him. Use your arms, steady your breathing, James coached gently. Don't rush. Feel your balance. Ethan's legs trembled, his arms shook, and his face turned red with effort. For a few seconds, he lifted himself an inch off the chair, then dropped back down. Laura's heart sank, but before she could speak, James crouched beside the boy. You did it, he said firmly. That's a victory. But I didn't stand, Ethan said quietly. Not yet, James replied with a smile. But you started. Every guard starts somewhere. That became their rhythm. Every session was filled with small victories, each one celebrated like a grand event. Some days Ethan was frustrated. He'd cry out of exhaustion, whispering, I can't. And every time James would gently say, yes, you can. You already are. Weeks turned into months. Slowly, Ethan's balance improved. He could hold himself up for a few seconds longer, then 5, then 10. His legs were still weak, but something had changed inside him. He no longer feared falling. He laughed when he stumbled. He believed in himself again. One day, after a particularly tough session, James sat with Laura by the palace garden bench while Ethan rested nearby. The winter air was cool and quiet. Laura turned to him and said softly, You've given my son something doctors couldn't. Hope. James looked down. He's given me something too. What's that? A reason to believe that kindness still matters, he said simply. Laura smiled faintly. You know, I used to pray for a miracle. I never imagined it would wear a red coat and a tall hat. James chuckled softly. Maybe miracles wear all kinds of uniforms. As the days passed, the bond between them grew stronger. Ethan began calling James Sir Turner as a joke, and James would salute him in return. Private Ethan, ready for duty, he'd say in a playful tone, making the boy laugh every time. But behind the laughter, James was planning something. He had made a quiet promise to help Ethan stand on his own before the year ended. He hadn't told Laura yet because he didn't want to give her false hope. But in his heart, he believed it was possible. So he started a new kind of training. Instead of focusing only on therapy, he introduced balance drills. Ethan practiced standing against the wall, holding onto a wooden stick James had cut down to Ethan's size. We'll call it your soldier's staff, James said with a grin. Ethan loved it. He even decorated the stick with a small drawing of the palace. Every time he used it, he imagined he was standing guard outside the royal gates beside James. Then one evening near Christmas, James came to visit them with a small wrapped box. Ethan tore it open and found a silver medal inside. What's this for? He asked, amazed. James smiled. It's the Royal Guard's token of courage. I had it made just for you. You've earned it. Ethan stared at the medal for a long moment, his eyes watering. I'll wear it the day I stand up, he whispered. James leaned forward, his voice low and steady. Then let's make that day soon. That night, as snow began to fall outside, Laura watched from the window while Ethan slept with the medal in his hand. She looked toward the street, where James was walking away under the streetlights, his red coat faintly glowing in the distance. She whispered to herself, God bless him. At the palace that night, James stood alone in the courtyard after everyone left. The snow fell gently on his shoulders. He looked at his own reflection in the palace window and whispered, Before the year ends, Ethan, you'll stand, I promise. He didn't know how, but he knew he wouldn't rest until he kept that promise. The morning of the big day began like any other, yet something felt different. The air outside Buckingham Palace was fresh and clear, the sky soft and blue. Tourists were already gathering by the gates, cameras ready. But this morning there was a quiet excitement in a small corner of the courtyard, because something special was about to happen. Ethan didn't know every detail, but he could feel it. He sat in his wheelchair holding the wooden stick that James had given him, the one he called his soldier's staff. He wore his favorite red jacket again, with the small silver medal pinned proudly to his chest. His mother, Laura, knelt beside him, straightening the blanket around his legs. She was nervous, even more than he was. Are you ready, sweetheart? She asked softly. Ethan nodded, his hands trembling slightly. I think so. A few steps away, James stood in full uniform, red coat shining, boots polished, black hat perfectly straight. But today he wasn't there as just a guard. He was there as Ethan's mentor, his friend, and the man who believed in him more than anyone else. When he turned and saw Ethan, his face softened. "Good morning, soldier," he said warmly. Ethan smiled. "Good morning, Sergeant Turner." The other guards nearby glanced over, curious but silent. Everyone in the palace had heard whispers about the little boy in the wheelchair, and the guard who had taken him under his wing. Some had even helped arrange this morning's small gathering. A few officers and palace staff stood quietly at the side, pretending to be busy. But really they were waiting to see something beautiful. James walked over to Ethan and knelt down so they were face to face. "Remember what I told you," he said gently. "Don't think about standing perfectly. Just think about standing once on your own." Ethan took a deep breath. His heart raced. "Okay." James nodded to Laura, who was trying hard not to cry already. She stepped back a little, her hands pressed together. Slowly, James positioned Ethan near the low training rail that had been brought into the courtyard. The wooden surface gleamed under the morning sun. Ethan placed both hands on it, then looked up at James one last time. "Ready?" James asked. "Ready," Ethan whispered. And then, the world seemed to go quiet. The crowd sounds faded. Even the guard standing nearby looked stiller than usual. Ethan took a deep breath and began to push himself up with all the strength he had. His arms shook violently. His legs trembled like thin branches in the wind. For a second, nothing happened. Then, slowly, his body rose. He lifted himself an inch, then two. His face tightened with effort, his knuckles turning white. James leaned forward, not touching him, just close enough to catch him if he fell. "Come on, lad," he said softly. "You can do this." "I'm right here." Ethan's knees wobbled. He bit his lip and pushed harder. The muscles in his arms burned, his legs quivered under him, but then suddenly he was standing. Laura gasped. Her hand flew to her mouth. The palace courtyard, once filled with quiet chatter, fell into total silence. Ethan was standing. Not perfectly. Not straight. But he was standing, his body shaking, eyes wide, face red but upright. James felt his chest tighten with pride. "That's it," he said quietly, voice thick with emotion. "You're standing, Ethan. You're really doing it." Tears welled up in Ethan's eyes, but he smiled through them. I'm standing." "Yes, you are," James said, smiling so wide that for once the guard who never broke expression looked human and warm. For a few seconds, Ethan just stood there, breathing fast. Then James said softly, "Do you think you can take a step?" Ethan blinked. "A step?" "Just one," James said. "Let's see if those legs remember what they were made for." Laura's heart pounded so loudly she could barely breathe. Ethan gripped the rail again and focused. His right leg trembled as he tried to move it forward. For a moment it refused. Then slowly, inch by inch, it shifted. His foot touched the ground ahead of him. His balance nearly slipped, but James steadied him with a light hand on his shoulder. "That's one," James said quietly. "Now the other." Ethan tried again. His left leg followed, weaker but determined. The second step came slower. His mother's tears spilled freely now. "That's two," James said softly. "You're walking, soldier." And then came a third. A small shaky step, but it was real. Ethan let out a small laugh that turned into a sob. "Mom, I'm walking." Laura ran forward, her hands covering her mouth. "You're doing it, Ethan." "You're really doing it." By now, the few people watching couldn't hold back either. One guard quietly wiped his eyes. Another smiled behind his still posture. Even a tourist nearby, unaware of the story, began clapping softly, thinking it was part of a ceremony. But to everyone who knew, this was something far greater than any ceremony. When Ethan finally lost balance and leaned forward, James caught him gently before he could fall. The boy was laughing and crying at the same time, holding onto James's arm. "I did it," he said breathlessly. "I stood." James nodded, his voice trembling. "Yes, you did. You kept your promise." Laura knelt beside her son, hugging him tightly as her tears soaked his jacket. "I'm so proud of you," she whispered again and again. "So proud." James stepped back for a moment, watching them. For the first time in his years of service, his heart felt full in a way no medal or ceremony had ever given him. He looked at Ethan, this small boy who had fought so hard, who had believed even when life said no, and he felt something deep shift inside him. As they rested for a few minutes, more people began to gather around. Someone had filmed the moment on their phone without even realizing its importance. A few claps turned into a soft cheer. James raised a hand slightly. and the guards nearby instinctively straightened their backs in silent respect. Then James turned to Ethan again and said, "Do you want to salute, soldier?" Ethan grinned, still catching his breath. He raised his trembling hand to his forehead and gave the sharpest salute he could manage. James returned it instantly, standing tall. The other guards followed. For a few seconds, the courtyard was filled with stillness again, but this time it wasn't silent duty. It was reverence. When they finally left the palace that day, Ethan wouldn't stop smiling. His cheeks were red, his hands still trembling from effort, but his eyes shone brighter than ever. As they walked toward the gate, several guards along the path gave small nods of acknowledgement. "Mom," Ethan whispered as they passed through the gates. "Do you think I made them proud?" Laura smiled through her tears. "You made the whole world proud, sweetheart." James walked beside them quietly, carrying Ethan's soldier's staff. He handed it back as they reached the car. "You'll need this again," he said softly. Ethan shook his head with a grin. "Not as much as before," James smiled. "Maybe not, but keep it close. It's part of your story now." Laura looked at him, her voice breaking a little. "I don't know how to thank you, James." "You already have," he replied. "You raised a hero." As they drove away, James watched their car disappear into the busy London street. For a long while he just stood there, still in uniform, hands clasped behind his back. He could hear faint cheers from inside the palace courtyard where the moment had happened, and in that quiet after the noise, he felt peace. A kind of peace that only comes when you know you've helped someone find their strength again. Later that evening, as the city lights flickered on and the palace grounds emptied, James stood alone in front of the royal gate. The wind carried the faint sound of laughter from the streets beyond. He smiled to himself and whispered, "Mission accomplished, soldier." Far from him, in a small apartment on the edge of the city, Ethan placed his silver medal and the soldier's staff beside his bed. Before sleeping, he looked at them and whispered, "Thank you, Sergeant Turner. I'll walk more tomorrow." And for the first time in his life, he believed with all his heart that he truly would. The next morning, London woke up to something extraordinary. Across social media, news channels, and morning shows, a video had begun spreading fast. It showed a royal guard in full uniform standing beside a little boy in a wheelchair. The boy was trying to stand, his face red with effort, while the guard spoke softly, encouraging him. Then the crowd gasped as the boy slowly lifted himself up and took his first shaky steps. The guard caught him when he stumbled, and the courtyard erupted in applause. By noon, the video had been shared thousands of times. By evening, it had reached millions. Headlines appeared everywhere. Royal Guard breaks protocol to help disabled boy walk. The most heartwarming moment at Buckingham Palace. And kindness in uniform guard helps child take his first steps. In their small apartment, Ethan and his mother sat on the couch watching it together on TV. Ethan's face glowed with excitement. "Mom, that's me. That's me walking." Laura laughed through tears. "Yes, sweetheart. That's you." The video showed everything. The moment he stood, the steps he took, the crowd's cheer, and James's proud smile. But what touched people the most was the way the guard knelt and hugged the boy afterward. It was a simple gesture, but it carried more emotion than any words ever could. Ethan leaned against his mother's shoulder. "Do you think Sergeant Turner saw it?" Laura smiled softly. "I'm sure he did, and I think he's just as proud as I am." Meanwhile, inside Buckingham Palace, James was indeed watching the same video. He sat in the small resting area used by guards during breaks. A few fellow guards stood behind him, smiling as the video replayed on a phone. "You made history, Turner," one of them said. "That's the first time I've ever seen a royal guard make the world cry." James chuckled quietly, shaking his head. "It wasn't me," he said. "It was the boy." "Still," another guard added, "the palace press office says they're getting letters and emails from people all over the world. Families, veterans, teachers, everyone's thanking you for what you did." James smiled faintly. Then maybe it was worth breaking the rules for once. That evening, when he finished his shift, James walked through the courtyard again. The same spot where Ethan had stood seemed different now. The light hit the stones in a way that made them almost shine. He paused there for a moment, remembering the boy's trembling legs, the smile on his face, and the sound of his mother's sobs of joy. He never imagined that one small act of kindness would travel so far. He hadn't done it for attention. He'd done it because, in his heart, he couldn't ignore a child's hope. A few days later, James received a letter from the royal office. His heart pounded as he opened it. It was an official commendation, signed and sealed, recognizing him for exemplary compassion, service, and humanity. The palace had decided to share the story publicly, calling it a moment that reminds the nation that true strength lies in kindness. When the newspapers printed his name, the story reached even more people. But James stayed humble. When reporters tried to interview him, he simply said, "I didn't help him because I'm a guard. I helped him because I'm a person." Meanwhile, Ethan became something of a local hero too. His school held a small celebration for him, decorating the gym with red and gold ribbons. His classmates clapped as he entered, proudly wearing his medal. He showed them the toy soldier James had given him and said, "This little soldier reminds me that I can keep going, even when it's hard." Teachers and parents wiped their eyes as they listened. One teacher whispered to another, "He's teaching all of us something today." A few weeks later, James visited their home again. When Ethan saw him, he nearly jumped from his chair in excitement. "Sergeant Turner," he shouted. James laughed warmly. "I thought I told you, it's just James when I'm not on duty." Ethan grinned. "Okay, James, did you see how famous we are?" James chuckled. "I did. Seems like the whole world knows your story now." Laura poured tea for them and said, "They keep calling me from news stations. They want us to come for interviews. But I told them we'd rather keep it simple." James nodded approvingly. "Good choice. The best stories live in hearts, not headlines." As they talked, Ethan suddenly said, "James, you remember your promise? You said we'd stand together before the year ends." James smiled. "I do remember." Ethan pointed at his walker near the wall. "Then let's do it now." Laura gasped softly. "Ethan, you're tired. Maybe tomorrow," but Ethan was already reaching for the walker. He pushed himself up, breathing deeply. His legs wobbled, but he steadied himself. James quickly stood beside him, holding out his hand, not to carry him, but to guide him. Ethan took one step, then another. His mother stood frozen, watching her son walk without help for almost 10 steps before gently sitting back down. The room was silent for a second. Then James said quietly, "You did that on your own." Ethan smiled proudly. "We did it together." That night after James left, Laura stood by her son's bed and whispered, "Do you know how many people you've touched, Ethan?" He shook his head sleepily. "No, but I just wanted to make Sergeant Turner proud." Laura smiled and brushed his hair. "You did, my love. More than you'll ever know." The story continued to spread. Letters started arriving from everywhere. People from Japan, America, Australia, India, all writing to thank Ethan and James for giving them hope. Some were from parents with children in wheelchairs. Others came from soldiers who had lost hope after injuries. One man wrote, "Watching that boy take his first step made me believe I could take mine again." Months later, when spring came, the palace organized a small private event to honor James Turner and young Ethan. It wasn't public or fancy, just a quiet ceremony in the palace garden with a few guests and guards. When they called Ethan forward, he walked slowly, proudly, to the small stage, holding James's hand. The crowd stood and clapped softly. A royal representative handed James a medal of service and then turned to Ethan. "And for bravery beyond measure," he said kindly. "We honor this young man who showed the world that courage comes in many forms." James pinned a small golden badge on Ethan's jacket. "Now you're officially one of us," he said with a smile. Ethan looked up at him, eyes full of joy. "Does that mean I'm a royal guard too?" James chuckled. "You always were." Laura watched from the crowd, her eyes full of tears. For years, life had tested them, but here they were, her son standing tall beside the man who changed everything. After the ceremony, as they walked through the garden, James looked down at Ethan and said, "You know what I learned from you?" "What?" Ethan asked. "That bravery doesn't always march in uniform. Sometimes it rolls in a wheelchair and keeps smiling anyway." Ethan laughed softly. "And you taught me that heroes can wear hats taller than their heads." They both laughed, and Laura couldn't help but join in. As the sun set over Buckingham Palace, the three of them stood quietly for a moment, watching the golden light fall across the courtyard, the same place where Ethan had taken his first steps. The memory of that day still felt fresh, alive, and full of meaning. James placed a gentle hand on Ethan's shoulder. "Never forget, soldier. You didn't just stand, you taught others to rise too." Ethan smiled. And you didn't just guard the palace. You guarded my dream. The wind blew softly, carrying laughter and peace through the garden. People passed by without knowing the full story, but those who did never forgot it. Weeks later, when the excitement faded and life returned to normal, Ethan continued his therapy stronger and happier than ever. Laura often caught him staring at his toy soldier and whispering, "Left, right, left." And sometimes, when they visited the palace again, a royal guard would glance his way and give a small, respectful nod, the same way it had all begun. For James Turner, his duty continued as before, standing tall, silent, and strong. But behind the still face and perfect posture was a man who carried a story that reminded him every day why he wore that uniform. Because true service, he knew now, wasn't just about guarding walls or following orders. It was about protecting hope. And somewhere in the crowd beyond the gates, a little boy who once could not walk sat smiling proudly, knowing that his steps, those small, trembling steps, had left footprints not just on the palace grounds but in the hearts of millions.